How do we move from an unhealthy to a healthy form of Christianity? The crux of what decides whether Christianity is healing or harmful has to do with its interpretation of the cross. Christianity is losing many people today because they no longer buy the preaching of moralistic self-denial in the name of a God who seems arbitrary and ambivalent, who asks us to love each other, but then is said to need a sacrifice on the cross to reconcile us to himself. The traditional interpretation of the cross has been used to break people's will, to make them submit to God, to die to themselves, and so on. Psychology tells us that much harm has been done this way. Souls have been mutilated by such theology. But what if that traditional interpretation of the cross that glorifies suffering is actually not at all what Jesus associated with his death? What if the cross only symbolizes going against a false life, a false self, not giving up and mutilating a true self, one's whole person, rather to give up a falsehood, a false way of living, a fear-based way of living. The very process of deeply formative psychotherapy can shed light on what the cross actually means. And that is what we want to look at today. Greetings and welcome to this lecture series on the revolutionary new way of reading the Bible by Eugen Drewermann, an internationally best-selling author of more than 100 books. Drewermann uses insights from psychology, philosophy, poetry, the sciences to help us read the stories of the Bible and also of fairy tales of great world literature as stories of our own lives. If this is your first time in this lecture series, you can find my previous lectures in a playlist on this channel. If you subscribe, you get notified of future lectures and other videos. In a total revamping of the Christian faith and of what's called theology, the talk about God, Drewermann argues that to understand why Jesus did have to die on the cross, we need depth psychology. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of depth psychology. You may have heard of psychoanalysis. Depth psychology is basically the beginning of modern psychology as we know it today. The idea of lying on the couch, reclining, and being in one's unconscious. That all started with depth psychology and psychoanalysis. Freud's psychoanalysis is the first version of that. Then Carl Gustav Jung created another one that's called analytical psychology. But depth psychology is called depth psychology because it goes into the depth of us. It doesn't just stay on the level of our thoughts, on what we consciously know, but it goes into our dreams. It goes into our unconscious, into all those things that we don't usually stay aware of, that is not present to us, but that shapes us. Recently, there has been a lot of work in psychology on trauma and how trauma gets basically inscribed in our body. We are often not aware of what's happening in our body, and that is also a form of the unconscious. We carry things in our body. And that way we experience things in our dreams at night are basically communications from our unconscious to us about what is really going on. Now, they have to be on some level deciphered, and dreams are using basically shapes in our psyche that have been laid down over thousands, millions of years in evolution to help us make meaning of ourselves, of our bodies, and of our lives. And so using depth psychology to understand this puzzling and so cruel event of the cross and how that could become a symbol for redemption. It is so contradictory to think that that could be a symbol for redemption, but it can be. Instead, though, the problem is that in Christianity, the cross has often been used not to redeem, but actually to do the very thing the cross wanted us to redeem from, namely from fear, from power that comes out of fear, from oppression, and from a false or distorted God image. Now, I've mentioned fear. What kind of fear leads people to kill other people, or to kill off other people, or to kill parts of ourselves? When we use that word kill here, we're not just talking necessarily about killing someone outside. That's not actually what the main point of the cross is, even though Jesus was killed. But the symbolic meaning of it is not about actually killing someone. It is about all the aggressions that go into the killing or the idea of killing. And it has to do with a fear that's related to actually the fear of death, the fear of dying to oneself or dying to people, the fear of losing one's meaning, the fear of not being important, the fear of being seen as immoral if one holds certain views, or as not socially acceptable, as an outcast, as not doing what one is supposed to do, the fear of what people might think, of what people might say about you. All of those fears keep our common social way of being together intact, that ostracizes people, that oppresses people, that scapegoats people, that creates hierarchies, that cast out certain groups, that feed prejudices. Those are the fears we're dealing with. The fear that keeps us false, that makes us hide ourselves, is the fear of freedom, says Drewermann. But why are we so afraid of freedom? That may sound like a strange question, but as a psychoanalyst myself, and simply also as a human being, I have witnessed many times how afraid we are to be free. Not just in the sense of being free from people or from oppression, but rather in the sense of being free to be truly who we are. Everyone is afraid to some degree of what others think, if they only truly knew who they were. If everyone's afraid of what others might think if they lived themselves, stood up for who they truly are. Jesus was truly free in that sense. That is why he was loved. That is why people at first praised him, sang Hosanna and all of that to him, followed him. But this kind of freedom is very difficult. The freedom to be truly yourself is the most difficult thing in the world. And that is also why Jesus was eventually killed. Last week in the lecture, we talked about how Jesus didn't give in to the fear that wanted to take his freedom away. He didn't think of this fear as stronger than death. He didn't think of that fear as stronger than God. Instead, he defied fear. He remained true to himself. He did not sell out the people to whom he had preached a God of unconditional love, of a God who does not want you to first do A, B, C before you can be acceptable, but rather who unconditionally accepts us because that God knows how afraid we are, and that God does not push us down but lifts us up. Now, last week, we had asked from the perspective of Jesus why he had to die and why his death could become a symbol for redemption. This week, we want to look at why Jesus died from the perspective of humans, of the humans that actually killed him. Drewermann had said that Jesus died from his perspective because he was truly free, free from the fear of what humans can do to him. He looked at his life from the perspective of a God who believed that we are unconditionally acceptable. Jesus' freedom from fear and his belief in a God who does not want us to be afraid questioned and indeed exploded all the rules we create in all religions and all systems that are based on fear. From the perspective of Jesus, Jesus had to die only because his whole life wanted to say that from the perspective of God, we could defeat fear and would be able to live as free humans. That was a quote from Drewermann. That is why the cross, quote, this cursed stigma, this monstrous embodiment of all human torture, unquote, could become a sign of salvation. It symbolizes the defeat of fear, even of the fear of death. But if we look today at the cross from the second perspective, from our perspective, from our human perspective, meaning those humans who want to be free but are so often afraid of it, from the perspective of those who, as Drewermann puts it, paradoxically kill what would let us live. We will go deeply into the dynamics that can heal in us if we understand the cross by means of psychology, as Drewermann does. And I see that in my psychotherapeutic work and also in the consultation supervision I do on that kind of work of other therapists and pastoral counselors, how often people are afraid of being truly free. All the dependencies that are there, all the fears that one would be alone, all the fears that one would be meaningless come up when one is trying to work through those very fears that keep people not well in their mind, and yet hanging on to those fears. Today's lecture may well be the most important one in this lecture series to date, because we will follow Drewermann on a fascinating journey into the deep psychological meaning of the key Christian idea of the so-called death of the Son of God. This idea is often just thrown around as a dogmatic formula without any understanding of the actual universal experience it is talking about. Because actually, this is not something that just is present in Christianity. It has been found in other religions as well. Drewermann shows that modern psychology can help us understand why this idea has been so influential and how it can today be understood in a therapeutic, healing, and liberating way, rather than in the harmful, neurotic, and oppressive way it so often has and continues to be used to this day. One of the ideas that we're not going to flesh out much today is that the reason why this idea of the death of the Son of God is present in so many religions is that it probably represents an archetype in our psyche. That means an image that every once in a while comes spontaneously up in our dreams. And if you have dreams of somebody being sacrificed or somebody has to do something that they're not wanting to do, there are many versions of how this can show up without an explicit religious meaning. But the death of the Son of God is itself something that has deep evolutionary roots. It is connected in the Hebrew scriptures with the idea of a scapegoat, or we, in our language today, might use that as well. So as we go into this fascinating exploration, hold on tight, to really understand Drewermann's radically new insight about the cross and how it relates to our own lives, it is important to listen to the very end of this lecture today, because the lecture slowly builds, and then at the end, there is the big experience of, that is what this means. At least that is my hope, that you will experience it this way. I certainly experienced it this way when I read this first. I was in seminary when I read this first in 1991. And the culmination of this writing that I'm going to read to you in this lecture here today is really crucial. I will read a translation from a central passage in Drewermann's commentary on the Gospel of Mark, Volume 1, and it begins on page 61. This is the commentary. Here, the Gospel of Mark, Part 1, Images of Redemption. And I'm translating this right now in preparation for a publication in English. The book has been translated into many languages. It's available in Italian, in French. I believe there's a translation in Spanish, in Portuguese, so many other languages, but not yet in English. It's also in Dutch, and I will work toward getting it published in English so that we can apply these texts to our own experience today. So here's what Drewermann writes about the interpretation of the cross that leads to resurrection, to redemption. He writes, sometimes one has to read key works of great people of a century differently than they are literally meant in order to appreciate their meaning and importance. At face value, Sigmund Freud's treatise on totem and taboo is a hypothetical reconstruction of certain events at the beginning of human evolution as a prehistoric genealogy of morality, to say it with Friedrich Nietzsche, as an attempt also to substantiate the origin of the psychological content of certain rituals of primitive tribal cultures. But one must not give too much credit to this external claim and appearance. The literature used by Freud was considered already during his own time to be rather one-sided. His knowledge of the relevant facts corresponded basically to the level of knowledge of an interested layperson. And the conclusion he arrived at with considerable effort, which in his opinion were to put an end to every past and future religion through psychoanalytic enlightenment, seem almost bizarre today. And yet, strangely enough, it is precisely they that help us decisively to understand the necessity of the death of Jesus. According to Freud's words, the foundation of all human culture, of morality as well as religion, consists in a primeval crime by which a baboon-like horde of Stone Age hominids would have killed the alpha animal of the group, the primeval father, in an act of common rebellion because of his despotic arbitrariness and his draconian monopoly claim to all females of the horde, and would have consumed him afterwards in a cannibalistic meal. After the deed, however, through this oral identification with the murdered one, the figure of the primeval father was re-established in the psyche of the sons in lasting greatness as a source of never-ending feelings of guilt and as the source of three essential cultural laws. The prohibition of the murder of the totem animal, meaning the father, the prohibition of its oral appropriation, meaning cannibalism, and above all, the taboo of incest, the exogamy rule. What Freud wanted to solve, particularly with this fantastic sounding theory, was the energetic problem of how it should be possible to subject the strength of the drives of the id. That means our animal side, so to speak, our instincts, our impulses, our unconscious desires. How it should be possible to subject the strength of these drives of the id to the dictates of the demands of culture, what culture demands of us. This problem seemed to him, meaning Freud, solvable under the condition that the moral religious conscience itself would be nothing more than the internalized violence of the strivings of an absolute father authority, whose imitation actually would be what the religions of humankind call God. So to just unpack that a little bit, so the idea here is Freud thought that after this baboon-like horde had killed the primal father, they realized that now that he was gone, they had to compete for the females in their horde again with each other, and then they had remorse. And as a result of remorse, they identified with the father and basically set him up in their minds as what we call today the superego, the law of the father, as it also is called. And that this superego, this law of the Father, this idea of basically the primeval Father in our head, is what turned into religion. That's the basis of religion, Freud thought. So this would be, Freud thought, the Oedipal origin of religion. Oedipal meaning the myth of Oedipus, Oedipus killing his father, not knowing that it was his father, but killing his father. That's the Greek myth after which Freud named this. And so that's why we talk about an Oedipus complex. The idea that a child wants to bump one parent out of the picture to have the other parent completely for themselves. Stereotypically, the boy wanting the mother for himself and seeing the father as the rival. So this all is the basis of the Oedipus complex. Now, Drewermann, just like other people, is very aware and is agreeing with a lot of the critique that Freud gets for his theory. So here Drewermann writes, "We do not need to repeat here the numerous arguments that prehistorians, cultural anthropologists, and ethnologists have and can put forward against this scientific myth of Freud. What is essential in our context, contrary to all objections, though, is the absolutely accurate description that Freud has provided in exemplary clarity of the ambivalence of the image of God in a patriarchal religion." So Freud portrays something about patriarchy and patriarchal religion that is very helpful, even if the historical underpinnings of what Freud is talking about are not accurate. Freud describes the dynamics in patriarchal religion. So that's accurate, as well as his portrayal of the extremely contradictory process of inner liberation from all the aggressions that have been pent up since childhood, which are directed first at one's own father, but then also at the figure of the Father in heaven. It is primarily this analytical process of working through ancient Oedipal aggressions, the psychological prehistory in humans, which also makes it possible to understand the archetype of the killed God as a symbol of redemption. At this point, every religion must learn from one of the great atheists and humanists of the last century, how God must not be if humans want to live humanely. So this is a really important point, because Drewermann has mentioned in many of his books that great atheists like Freud have very valid points, because they point out how God cannot be if we want to live humanely. And so what has to be done is that we take back the projections of all of our own aggression, of all of our strife, of all of our fears that we have put into God, and we have to take them back out of the God image. That's the only way to recover a healthy religion. That's the only way to recover a healthy form of Christianity. For that, it is, though, very important that the cross no longer gets interpreted in the sadomasochistic fashion it so often is interpreted, and it will again be preached on countless thousands of pulpits this coming week of Easter. So if you want to hear a different way of interpreting this story, listen on. Or if you want to, maybe if you're a preacher and you want to see, is there another way of preaching about this that doesn't basically mutilate people, that doesn't suppress people, that doesn't set a deadly opposition between humans and God, then listen on. If one looks at the symbol of the crucified Christ independently from depth psychology, and possibly also independently from the numerous parallels of the archetype of the killed deity in the history of religion, then the danger is unavoidable that one simply takes note of the event of Golgotha, that is the place where Jesus was crucified, as an external historical fact, the truth of which makes no sense from within, but at best impresses in the sense of moral example. If Christ died for us on the cross, then according to this non-psychological approach, then the duty for every Christian is henceforth to the discipleship of the cross. Numerous passages of Mark's gospel seem to fit with such a demand in Mark 8, 31 to 33 and 34 to 38. A Christianity of suffering and sacrifice is then categorically opposed to the immediate strivings of humans for a fulfilled and happy life. Indeed, under such circumstances, it must already be regarded as something totally sinful and egoistic for a person to want to find themselves or to realize themselves. If humanity can only be redeemed when an infinitely offended and angry God is reconciled through the substitutionary sacrifice of his Son on the wood of the cross, then each individual can participate in such liberation from the penalty of sin only by realizing Christ's suffering in her or his own life. So this all is the non-psychological reading of the cross that breeds sadomasochistic suffering and aggression in the culture at large. The culture wars, particularly in the United States around religion, are all wrapped up in this sadomasochistic interpretation of the cross, and together with a completely wrong interpretation of the so-called false story. But we've talked about this in earlier lectures. I'll continue with Drewermann's text here. A psychotherapeutic theory and practice, which, like psychoanalysis, declares as its goal to make humans again capable of happiness and enjoyment, very much in an earthly sense, to reduce their guilt feelings and to increase their ego strength, their assertiveness, and their identity with themselves. Such a philosophy can, under these sadomasochistic circumstances, be understood only as anti-Christian hedonism, as value-destroying egoism, indeed as methodical and practical atheism. In view of the Christian self-portrayal, it was, on the other hand, also more than understandable that psychoanalysis, from its own point of view, fought with all means as just such a father religion of suffering, to the point that such a father religion of suffering, to the point that Freud even expressed the hope that humankind might someday be permanently cured of such ideas of infantile fear and dependence on the father as the epitome of a collective obsessive neurosis. A redemption not through religion for Freud, but definitely a redemption from religion. In fact, if the theology of Christianity, exegesis and dogmatics in particular, insists on its externalism in the understanding of suffering and redemption. Externalism meaning understanding the cross just as an external event back then in history somewhere that somehow has some magic effect on us today. So if the theology of Christianity, exegesis and dogmatics in particular, insist on its externalism in the understanding of the suffering and redemption, which avoids any psychological mediation, then it inevitably attracts the reproach from psychoanalysis of being nothing more than a solemnized and religiously painted over descendant of the Oedipus complex. The arguments put forward by psychoanalysis can all be confirmed by experience. The infinite insult of the Father God, the blatant sin of the human children, consists in psychoanalytic perspective in the quite natural desire of every child or male child to be and to remain the only lover of his mother. And Freud here didn't think really of sexuality in a mature sense. It meant to have the mother for oneself. With this very desire, however, the child threatens the older claims and rights of the father, who in turn threatens the son as punishment with castration. It is eventually only this castrative submission to the sadism of the father's authority that is able to appease the anger of the jealous patriarch. This is in the Oedipus complex. A religion that declares such ideas to be central dogmas of its teaching does, according to Sigmund Freud, nothing else than elevate in barbaric fashion as its ideal the archaic sexual repression, the mutilation of the human capacity for love, dictated by severe masochistic guilt feelings, as well as by an ever ambivalent attitude of self-humiliation and self-denial. The Oedipus complex, the obsessional neurosis, forms in this way the experiential background and the interpretive template also of the historical fact of the execution of Jesus. In the attempt of psychoanalysis to make the Oedipal contents of experience conscious and to dissolve them as far as possible, it must by its whole design naturally strive to push back such a religion of the Oedipus complex as the reason or justification of such a compulsively neurotic attitude to life. This is how things remain as long as Christianity understands the doctrine of the redemptive death of Jesus externally. It serves not redemption, but alienation, not liberation, but oppression, not humanization, but repression. Does it have to be like this? Does it have to stay that way? It is an outrageous, scandalous fact that the religion of Jesus, which arose from the struggle against the authoritarian oppression of humans in the name of a despotic God, has been suspected for good reasons for the past 180 years. Indeed, has been charged with the often substantiated accusation that it is basically nothing than the very ideology of such a morally dressed up sadism, a form of institutionalized external control and anxiety, a grotesque repetition of the very scribal mentality that Jesus wanted to overcome with the strength of his whole person. And just as a reminder here, as I explicated at length in the lecture last week, when Drewermann talks here about scribal mentality or a religion that has a despotic God image, he is not talking about Judaism as the religion. He's talking about a religious attitude that is found in all religions. This is very important. In all religions, there are scribes. In all religions, there is a despotic God image. Drewermann makes references to many other religions in which this is the case. But Jesus lived in his own religion. And like other prophets in his own religion, he questioned the use of God for oppression. He did not reduce Judaism to that, but he said that this is always something that can happen in a religion, and he dealt with it in his own religion. Just as many rabbis actually dealt with it in their own religion as well. The problem or the possible misunderstanding of Christianity at this point, however, is apparently as old as the historically oldest gospel, as the passion story of Mark's gospel itself. And the reasons for this seem to lie in a certain dialectic already of biblical theology itself. In order to comprehend how it was possible that the expected Messiah, the Son of God, came into the world and was killed, the early church tried to tell the passion of Jesus, meaning the suffering story, that's the passion of Jesus for those who are not Christians, in such a way that the story of the Lord's suffering could appear as the fulfillment of Old Testament promises. First of all, of the songs of the suffering servant of God in Isaiah, also of certain quotations from the prophet Zechariah, and certain passages from the Psalms. This way of presentation was meant to justify, especially to Jewish listeners, that Jesus really was the promised Messiah, not only in spite of his death on the cross, but precisely because of it. But as understandable as this theological argumentation, which Mark had already found ready-made, was, in view of the Jewish hopes for the Messiah, it contains two weak points that had to become psychologically extremely dangerous as soon as they were separated from the immediate experience of the humanity of Jesus. And these two dangers are very important, so take note of them, please. Drewermann calls them the positivism of theological reasoning and the psychological return of the ambivalence of the image of God. I need to say briefly what both of these mean. The positivism of theological reasoning is basically what is very present in so much theological discourse, or in so much discourse about religion, where the theologians or the scholars or the religious officials say, it is so because we say it so, or it is so because it's written in the Bible somewhere. So just because it's written somewhere, therefore it is historical reality, or therefore this is what God says. That is positivism of theological reasoning. The reason given is that it's written somewhere, or because I say so, if I'm the Pope, or if I'm the bishop, or if I'm the priest, or whoever I'm with authority. The second thing, the psychological return of the ambivalence of the image of God, basically means Jesus tried to take the ambivalence out of the God image. Jesus did not portray a God that would punish us. Jesus did not portray a God who would first want us to do ABC before we could be saved. So many of the stories of Jesus never even talk about God. Instead, there are encounters that are inspired by an unconditionally accepting God, meaning a source of life that is not against us, a source of life that is love, an absolute ground that says we are loved. That is what the God of Jesus means. Absolute love. But instead, when the cross is understood in an external way, the ambivalence of God is reintroduced into the God image. Because now God is said to have needed this sacrifice, this killing of a human being. Let's continue. Psychoanalytic literature has repeatedly tried to explain why a religion of love of enemies and forgiveness, like Christianity, could produce so much guilt feelings and traits of intolerance, fanaticism, and sexual anxiety, or anxiety in general. The experiences of the martyrdom period in particular are said to have led to an understanding of suffering as the very condition of redemption, and to infect the Christian life of faith hopelessly with feelings of resentment, with ascetic world denial, and with extreme needs for revenge and vengeance. The period of the martyrs is all those who were killed at the end of the first century and the beginning of the first century, because they confessed that they believed in Jesus, and so there were many killed under emperors and so on. But let's continue. Presumably, however, Sigmund Freud already saw much clearer on this point. So it's not this historical argument, Drewermann says here. So Freud already saw much clearer on this point when he tried to tie the, quote, pathological features, unquote, of Christianity, not to specific historical events like the martyrdom period, but to the doctrine of the death of the Son of God himself. For as soon as this doctrine is no longer based on the necessary and fundamental contradiction of trust and anxiety, of humanity and inhumanity, of freedom and rigidity, then faith in the redeeming death of Christ, in fact, is in danger of becoming a theorem devoid of experience, which must psychologically inevitably develop an almost fatal dynamic of its own. While the initial goal was merely to bring faith in Christ for Jewish listeners into harmony with the testimony of the Bible, this very soon had to bring up the increasingly urgent question, not only whether, but above all, why God could at all have wanted his own Son to die on the cross. As these passages in the Hebrew scriptures were said to have predicted. The Gospel of Mark, or rather the Passion tradition it picked up, was content to declare that God wanted it this way. But the question remains, what kind of God this is who can want this way? As astute as the theological argumentation may present itself within the different models of reasoning about a ransom, like a price that Jesus had to pay for our sin, or about the balancing of divine justice, what emerges psychologically from the scriptural proof of the New Testament for the messianic nature of Jesus' suffering and death, the further one moved away from the immediate impression of the person of Jesus, is inevitably a monstrous image of God, because one sought to justify the process of redemption from God's perspective, rather than from the condition of the human experience. A God who does not spare his own son, but gives him up on the cross, a God who demands from his son obedience under cold sweat and tears, and who professes allegiance to the manifold tortured Son, whom, as the pious legend on top of it all assures, he could have easily saved, only after everything had already been finished. Such a God does not at all appear as a God of only redeeming love. He appears rather as incomprehensibly contradictory, as unimaginably cruel, indeed as archaic, barbaric, and brutish. It is a God image which is even more terrible than the notion of a just punishing God in the Old Testament, which Jesus wanted to supplement, correct, and overcome through the message and the visible proof of forgiving love in his own person. If one wants to understand the God of Good Friday as a cipher of redemption, then it is imperative to argue psychologically instead of theologically, from the perspective of humans instead of from God. For the truth about humans, about the whole extent of their need for redemption, can only really become evident in the twilight of the solar eclipse of Good Friday. If we look at the problem psychologically, then the experiences and explanations of Freud about the archaic crudeness of the human psyche present us precisely with a crucial hidden clue to the interpretation of the death of Jesus. However, then everything depends on understanding the drama of the crucifixion, not as a symbolic etiology or story of origin of the Oedipus complex, but to the contrary, as a psychodrama of healing, as a symbolic vicarious working through of the repressed feelings of hate, destruction, and revenge, hence as a depiction of everything which humans first have to experience and do before they can truly and unambiguously believe within the ghetto of their anxiety in something like forgiveness beyond all guilt. It is precisely in the experiences of analytical psychotherapy, and that means in depth psychotherapy or in psychoanalysis or in analytical psychology, or really in any psychotherapy that goes deeper, including existential psychotherapy. But Drewermann is here focused on psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and he calls that analytic psychotherapy. And he does not just refer to Freud, as we will see. He quotes self-psychology, Klein, and many other psychologists, which we don't have to go in here. But let's stay with his unpacking this, because this is fascinating now how he does this. It is precisely in the experiences of analytical psychotherapy that theology today has as its disposal an interpretive scheme that is capable for the first time of illuminating the very human character of such paradoxical entanglements. The most puzzling paradox of the Gospel of Mark, as well as of Christianity, becomes truly understandable only based on psychoanalytic experience. That it requires the killing of an innocent person, symbolic, never mind, in order to be liberated from one's lack of life. What was expressed in the Old Testament ritual with the image of the sacrificial lamb or the scapegoat has its basis and confirmation in the process of playfully acting out. Paradoxically, what can here too provoke the most violent outbursts of aggression is precisely an attitude shaped as much as possible by an acceptance free of violence and a validation free from prejudice. Ideally, an analytics therapy consists in keeping a contract agreed to at the beginning by the psychoanalyst and the analysant, called analyst and analysant. The patient commits himself to saying anything which comes to his mind. The most embarrassing things first. In some of his talks that Drewermann has given, he invites his listeners, and you're invited to do the same, to just for 5 minutes, try to say whatever comes to mind without censoring what comes to mind. You might record it and then see what happens. He compares that to one time, or sometimes he has compared this to that maybe, the image of a rabbit comes to mind, or of 7 rabbits, and then you follow the most smelly one. That would be an example of the most embarrassing things first. I continue. The therapist, on the other hand, promises to accept everything that is said unconditionally as psychological truth. That is, without rejecting, correcting, directing, or manipulating it. Only on the background of such a general permission to be. Only based on such a request for unrestricted truth will it be possible to express all those feelings that the patient, under threat of severe punishments, including the deadly loss of the parent's love, was prohibited since childhood to even experience consciously. And precisely at this point, a curious form of relationship, which varies from intensity, regularly emerges between the therapist and the client. The inner ambivalence and possibly positive development of this relationship offers an exact model for understanding the Christian drama of redemption too. In experiencing for the first time in his life a kind of care, esteem, and attention which he needed previously as a child, but received in his childhood only in part, the patient places upon the therapist a quite childish extent of trust and of longing for holding. Inevitably, he regresses thus at first into childhood, and step by step once again lives through and suffers through its feeling states and experiences, now, of course, consciously. If you do not become like children, you cannot enter into the realm of God, reads the established maxim in Mark 10:15 or Matthew 18:3 of what is probably the most important part of any analytic psychotherapy, the building up of a relatively stable transference. The word transference means that the client puts upon the therapist feelings and expectations which do not belong to her, that is the therapist, as a private person, but which basically derive from the early childhood pattern of the relationship to the parents, and which become visible only now through the therapist as a suitable plane of projection. Precisely because the analyst tries to pin down the patient as little as possible in terms of the therapist's own person during the treatment, and thus remains in a certain sense a blank slate, a situation of permission emerges for the patient in which he is allowed to re-experience and live out the very layers in himself that, like the famous 13th room in the enchanted castles of fairy tales, were until then absolutely off limits. With this approach, the analyst actually follows literally Jesus saying in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:41, if someone compels you to go with her 1 mile, go with her 2. Jesus obviously assumes in this instruction that people have the hardest time to ask the other for something precisely in moments of the greatest need. It would be too humiliating to appear dependent on in the other's eyes. It may be more likely that one transforms the request into a command or demand into a violent coercion. But even then, it is almost impossible to convey the full extent to which one needs the other person's assistance. We therefore must multiply by a factor of 2 the demand to be accompanied for 1 mile, which comes across as outrageous, in order to be able to imagine the true extent of the other person's need. In doing so, of course, it is important not to patronize him, the patient, or lure him onto paths that are not his own. He himself knows where he is at home and how he can reach his home. In the midst of the anxiety and the darkness of his life's journey, he only needs someone to walk with him until he dares to continue the journey alone. No analyst does principally anything else than translate this attitude of Jesus into practice. And yet, it now becomes apparent that as the patient gets closer to the home of his childhood, that not only the old feelings of longing for hold and security become loud again, but simultaneously also feelings that had been repressed in the past, of disappointment, of revenge, of anger, of jealousy, of rage, of powerlessness, of loneliness, of guilt, and of reparation. In short, on the bridge of help offered by the presence of the therapist, reappears the entire ensemble of rejecting aggressive attitudes that were once built up in the presence of the parents. Although, or rather, precisely because the therapist wants nothing more than that her patient, with all goodwill and all readiness for acceptance, find his way from the fears and dependencies of childhood to an independent life, she really must appear, the analyst, to his patient, to her patient, as a reincarnation of the old parental figures of father and mother. If a really new beginning is to be possible for the client, then the therapist must adopt their role for a long period of time. By trying to be understanding, as the parents of the patient in her childhood actually would have had to be, she sets free for the first time all the aggressions, cravings for revenge, and power struggles around the fact that in the patient that his father and mother were back then not exactly as he would have needed them in order for her own life to unfold without distortions. For quite some time, the therapist embodies as a substitute the figure of a positive counter-image to the ambivalent memory images, the imagos of the parents. Thus, she can, in a certain sense, only wish with all her heart that the repressed anger of childhood of the patient finally erupts, at least in relation to her person. For only if all the words of protest, of rebellion, of accusation, of reproach in the form of the therapeutic substitute figure of father and mother, which one as a child was not permitted to express because one had to assimilate to the will of the parents in order to survive, can be worked through, only then can that experience be catalyzed, which in the language of the Bible may indeed be called reconciliation. A sense of being from the ground up, prior to all censorship and conditioning to certain ways of behavior, justified to exist in the world and hence to be allowed to clearly set one's own boundaries, to follow through on one's own wishes, and to employ one's own skills and abilities in life. More specifically, the connection between aggression and self-discovery at the earliest stages of psychological development presents itself as follows. In any child who does not feel accepted in their entire existence by their parents, especially by their mother, a deadly fear emerges. In their fantasy, which can develop to the level of sadistic wishes of death, they will try to kill the evil, withholding mother in order to gain the good mother. Here, Drewermann now uses Melanie Klein's theory of object relations to illuminate the dynamic of the cross from another perspective. But at the same time, they feel guilty for their oral aggressions. That is, they fear the punishing persecution by the evil mother. This fear of punishment, however, only increases the rage of the child against the mother. Hence, a vicious circle is created, which can only be solved if the child represses their rage and makes an effort to comply all the more with the presumed expectations of their mother. But even if they succeed in this, the feeling remains henceforth that first of all, one has to earn the love of the parents. The recognition that can be acquired in this way, however, in the best case scenario, is given only for externally corrected behavior, but not for one's own person. And the morality that develops under these circumstances really consists in an elaborate system of punishments and of rewards that are given as premiums for the repression and suppression of one's own feelings. According to psychoanalysis, such processes play a role in the psychological development of any human being already during the oral depressive phase of their childhood. This is precisely why it is not possible to return to the truth of one's own person unless a trust has been built that, beneath the threshold of socially enforced conformity and of fears of loss of love, one can, despite all, be allowed to be absolutely justified and wanted in this world, even with the malice and destructive rage of an unloved child. This is the point at which analytic psychotherapy becomes not only a model for the Christian doctrine of redemption, but leads in itself to the very experiences of religious quality that centrally shape Christianity. A child has to ask whether her parents can love her. An adult who lives once more through the hell of his childhood in psychoanalysis also asks to be sure about the significance of his parents in respect to the first years of his life. However, in doing so, he's fundamentally no longer concerned only with regaining the past, but far more with forming a primal trust in the background of her existence as a whole. So this is very important, this point here. Because Drewermann here talks not just about people that are in psychoanalysis, he's talking about the challenge that all adults basically have. Because all adults deal with fears of not being enough, of not being good enough, of, in the face of death, not mattering. And as adults, we do not just look back into the past to reconcile ourselves, but instead we're trying to reconcile ourselves to our existence, to the basis of our existence, the foundation of our existence. And so the transference situation in psychoanalysis that has to do with the parents becomes, in religion or in spirituality, a transference situation in relation to the origin of life. And there, I don't mean the Big Bang, evolutionary or cosmologically, yes, the Big Bang, but that's a scientific attempt to explain the universe, but not to understand why we're here in the first place, why we exist, not historically, but in terms of meaning. What's the significance of us? So that is the question about the background of our existence, the underpinning, the foundation, or as Paul Tillich called it, the ground of being. What is the foundation of our being? I continue with Drewermann here. No psychoanalytic, and we're almost at the end of this lecture, no psychoanalytic treatment can be the foundation of this trust. All it can do is clear away the psychological reasons that get in the way of such a fundamental attitude of trust. But in doing so, the analytic practice of treatment itself presupposes a spiritual conviction, such as the one which the religion of Jesus essentially wants to catalyze or facilitate, you might say. The conviction that the origin of our existence must not be imagined in itself, beyond all the ambivalence necessarily contained in the image of the human parents, as frightening, rejecting, hostile, revengeful, and jealous. So this origin should not be imagined that way. That is what Jesus tried to do, to not imagine it that way. It would indeed equal the slander and distortion of God if one wanted to transfer the fears and ambiguities which are common among humans into the relationship to God. Psychoanalysis as well as religion, in that sense, aim together, although with different approaches, at the cleansing and clarification of the Father image at the end of Oedipal sadism. And both know that it is futile if one wants to build a temple of humanity on the shaky ground of all sorts of repressed anxieties, aggressions, and guilt feelings. Both therefore try, through the person of a substitute of the frightening father authority, by way of a substitute assumption of age-old suffering, to set free again those powers of one's life that were buried early on, in order to enable a new beginning that is truer, more honest, more open-hearted, less anxious, filled with more ego strength, and is more trusting than the previous path of inhuman sacrifices and dutiful cruelties was. One understands the paradoxical human meaning of many words and references in the Gospel of Mark about the necessity of suffering, the inevitability of the cross, and the resurrection from the realm of the dead, only in the sense of such a therapeutic working through of the most difficult feelings of anxiety and guilt that a human being can live through. The primordial fear of and primordial protest against being unjustified and unloved on earth. So now one also understands what all these passages that Drewermann just mentioned mean about the suffering. It is about God being able to take all of our aggression. And in fact, Drewermann had already talked about this in his book on Christianity and war, The Spiral of Anxiety, War and Christianity, in which he already talked about how the idea of Christianity that is at the heart of it, the cross and the resurrection of Christ, is not this moralistically charged, oh, you killed Jesus, you are bad, this is how horrible you are, but rather that the cross became a symbol for a God that unconditionally accepts, a God that can take all of our aggressions, and that we could, for instance, solve the problem of war if we, instead of pointing our aggressions against each other, against humans, against other humans, that we would use the image of the cross and then of the eating of the Godhead that got connected with it, the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, in which this is acted out symbolically. This is the body of Christ given for you and the blood of Christ shed for you, and that we identify with it, not because we have to suffer, but we are allowed to bite it, to aggress onto God, so that we no longer have to do it to other humans by fighting humans, by killing humans outside, and no longer have to do it to ourselves masochistically. But this requires a spiritualization of the aggression in us that often is triggered when we are afraid. So this is Drewermann's solution to the problem of violence. Our society today is so far from this kind of non-violent working through of our violence. But this is what Drewermann is talking about here. Let me finish up here. Anyone who, in contrast, does not constantly keep in mind the dialectic of all human intentions in the face of the counter-finality of the unconscious, repressed material in the deep layers of the human psyche, inadvertently, plainly misunderstands, in the sense of an ascetic moralism, the entire concept of the Gospel of Mark and its fully consistent sequence leading up to the story of the Passion. What Drewermann is saying here, if we misuse the cross in a way as, oh, you know, Jesus died on the cross, so don't be angry, don't be bad, don't have these bad thoughts, instead repress them. What happens when we repress rather than give it to God, act it out? And there is imagery in Christianity that says we can give our sins to and put it on the cross, but often that is also done in a sadomasochistic way. So Drewermann is saying here, the counter-finality means the repressed always comes out in some way. So somebody who's trying very hard to be very nice then may make a snide remark. So the repressed comes out. That's the counter-finality of unconscious. And so the intention to do morally good behavior often leads to other behavior. And that's where the adage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, morally good intentions, comes from. Because when we do it like that, rather than working it through, it leads to havoc. Drewermann continues, they will thus condemn themselves, if we do it in this masochistic way of repression, inevitably to distort the religion of freedom and redemption into an ideology of obsessive, compulsive nightmares within which God, the God of Jesus Christ, has to appear even more horrible than the bloodthirsty gods of war, of sun and of fertility of the Mesoamerican Aztecs, as Huitzilopochtli, Tonatiuh, and Xipe-Totec, which literally means our Lord the Oppressor. In a redemptive sense, as a therapeutic cipher, the death of Jesus on the cross means precisely that it is not worth being afraid of humans because it is no longer necessary to be afraid of God. It was and is precisely this belief of Jesus which found expression in all of his words to and encounters with humans, and which was confirmed in his death. We humans may do what we want, and we can have done what we want. The first and the most important word of God on all human anxiety and guilt will be a word of understanding and a word of forgiveness. Exactly because this contradicts at first everything that we have become accustomed to learn and to follow in our everyday life. This conviction of Jesus generates at first a tremendous amount of resistance. Just imagine if we really took this serious, that God accepts us no matter what we have done. And if we try to shape our society with that in mind, then all the resistance in society comes up. All the fears come up of what all these people would do. However, Drewermann continues, in the course of this resistance of all of the suppressed feelings, too, are washed from the depth to the surface until the water cleanses itself and becomes transparent to its bottom. Precisely because the early church connected the death of Jesus with the words of the Last Supper. Here Drewermann makes a connection again. One cannot but say from the perspective of the oral background of the childish feelings of guilt, that the death of Jesus does not so much mean atonement and justice in the juridical sense, but represents the consequence of a simple as well as life-giving experience. If the first confusions of fear and guilt, as psychoanalysis has shown, are created from the ambivalences of oral sadism, long before they are later transferred from the experience of the child with her mother to the father, in order to distort his person too, within a field of fear, competitive envy, and self-mutilation. So I'll start the sentence again. If the first confusions of fear and guilt, as psychoanalysis has shown, are created from the ambivalences of oral sadism, then there is no other way than to evoke and relive vicariously in relation to a new mother and father figure this whole drama of fear in form of an oral ritual until it becomes clear and trustworthy enough. That God is more fatherly than any father and more motherly than any mother. Unambiguously, God wants us to live. Even if we are as bad as we have been taught to fear we are since our childhood, God nevertheless wants us to live beyond death, beyond guilt, and beyond anxiety. Because only in this trust into God, when all the distorting masks of duty, of possessions, and of cruelty have been lifted out and laid down, will we notice how rich and how valuable we truly are. Exactly for that reason, the crucified Christ becomes bread for the world, because he embodies in his life, as well as in the manner of his death, an abiding certainty, what no mother is able to tell her child. God, with no ambiguity whatsoever, wants to say to the human being, we are allowed to live without having to wrap the simple fact of our existence into shrouds of old feelings of fear and of guilt. God is like bread and wine, like flesh and blood, primordially maternal from the very beginning. And so it is very important that we understand that the cross is not about really the physical torture of Jesus. The redemptive value of the cross is that this horrific event connected with the archetype of the death of the Son of God in the human psyche, with the dynamic in us that is ready for us to use as a symbol that we can act our aggression and all the things in us that destroy out unto God, because God is the one who will never die. God can take it, and God won't punish us for it. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott similarly describes psychotherapy in that way, that the therapist on some level has to take all the negative feelings the patient has about the therapist, listen to them, not retaliate, and then the client can become real to themselves, because all of these angry expressions are actually only there because one couldn't be one who one really is. So what Drewermann writes here is not a justification to express physical violence or anything like that. It is a spiritual dynamic that has to be expressed in words and in context that we as society need to create, where people can work through these terrible fears and the deepest feelings of aggression inside in safe ways. I want to end with a quote from the second volume of Drewermann's commentary on the Gospel of Mark about Easter, which emphasizes that Easter is not about the doctrine of immortality, but about living fully here. Resurrection, what comes out of this working through of our aggression, of our fears, that resurrection is not something that is in the far distant past after this life. That's what I will conclude. It's a short quote on page 696 in the second volume of the commentary of the Gospel of Mark. The message of immortality fills us with a longing for eternity. But in contrast, the message of Easter morning gives us the indestructibility of joy here in this life and beyond. It gives us back the taste of life now. It gives us the strength to lead these few years of our earthly life in such a way that we encounter Jesus again in every human being, walking together with him on the way to heaven. On this note, we conclude for today. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture, and if you have, feel free to share it and tune in again in 2 weeks. This is an important lecture, an important piece of writing. If you know of anyone who struggles with the cross, or if you know of any preachers that are preaching a masochistic, a sadomasochistic gospel that harms rather than redeems, then send a link of this video to them. Ask them to listen to the end and maybe discuss it with them. This could also be something that could be looked at together in congregations. But anyway, if you liked it, tune in again in 2 weeks this time. Next week, the week of Easter, we will not meet here on YouTube. In 2 weeks, we will begin again on Fridays because Eugen Drewermann himself will restart his lectures in Germany. The summer semester starts on April 23rd for him. We will have 3 more lectures after this lecture in this series on the Gospel of Mark. Next week, we will look at stories about the stilling of the storm in the Gospel of Mark. My wish for you this Easter week is in the spirit of our lectures, to be free of the fear to be truly yourself, to find redemption from internalized aggression in form of guilt feelings or unproductive anger by directing it where it doesn't come back at you or doesn't hurt you or others like a boomerang. Namely, directed to an unconditionally loving God in the background of our existence. In that spirit, happy Easter.